To our third lecture of the calendar year, our third, actually fourth, maybe if we anyway, event on Zoom. So one of the advantages of having our events on Zoom is that we've been able to have prominent speakers from Greece, from the United Kingdom, and now today from Canada. So I want to welcome Sakis Gekas, who is Associate Professor and the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair in Modern Greek History at the York University. He's one of the most prominent social and historians of the recent years, and I just want to refer to a question that one of the participants raised to our last speaker, Professor Richard Clogg, who's probably represents the generation that really started looking at 1821 and sort of formulating some of his ideas. And someone asked, have there been any new sources, new interpretations of the War of 1821? And I think here Professor Gekas will answer that question by showing us a whole new different set of sources that he's working with. Sakis' recent book project includes Xenocracy, State, Class, and Colonialism in the Ionian Islands, 1815 to 1864. And the forthcoming book, The Relics of the Struggle, Veterans, Widows, and Orphans of the Revolution, 1821 to 1850, published by the National Research Foundation in Athens. And it's on this exciting new book that he will be lecturing tonight. I should also say that Sakis is going to be the host. York University will be the host of the next Modern Greek Studies Association that had to be postponed, due to the pandemic. So the entire Modern Greek Studies community is looking forward to Sakis' hospitality coming ahead. Hopefully, most likely in person. So anyway, Saki, welcome to the Hellenic University Club. As you can see, a very intimate group of Philhellenes, and I will turn the podium, as it were, over to you and let you share your presentation. So thank you for coming all the way from Canada to share your research with us.
Steve, thank you very, very much, first of all, for the invitation. Zoe and everyone at the Hellenic University Club, it's a great honor to meet you and be invited to share some of the research and work I've been doing on particular aspects of the history of the revolution of 1821. It is an anniversary year, and no one had anticipated that it would be commemorated as such in the way that it is commemorated. However, as Kostis mentioned, it has given us an opportunity to connect in unprecedented ways and in ways that we would have otherwise not been able to do if we had been meeting in person, a totally different experience. This is the last of a 5 series, the 5th of a 5 series talks I've been giving on various aspects of the history of the Greek Revolution, as I've been trying to think and approach it from hopefully new and interesting ways. The first one I gave was the history of the diaspora and its role in the Greek Revolution. The second was on Philhellenes, something that I'm sure the Hellenic University Club and people in Philadelphia know very, very well. In the third and fourth talks, I approached the history of the revolution from the Ionian and the Aegean seas, respectively. So sort of a maritime history of the revolution, looking at the role of Ionians, the Ionian Islands, a region right next to where the revolution broke out and evolved, of course, and the role of the Aegean Sea and its islands and its people during the revolution. So today, it's a great pleasure, and I really look forward to your comments and the discussion and the question, as I will be talking about the people who fought during the revolution, but particularly I will be looking at what happened to them after the revolution. The talk is titled "The Relics of the Struggle," in a phrase, following a phrase that I will be discussing later, that was told. This is what the people were called in 1850 by a minister and the subtitle, Veterans, Widows and Orphans of the 1821 Revolution. It is often said, as George Santayana said, the Spanish literary figure, poet and novelist, that only the dead have seen the end of the war. And it is a powerful phrase that has been in my mind ever since I've been thinking about how to approach the history of the revolution and the people who fought, and the history of the people who fought the revolution beyond the standard accounts of those who are called the heroes, the very famous figures of that war. In other words, what happens to people after the war ends? And most importantly, when does a war such as this end? And the first images I've had of people who suffered injuries that scarred them for life and disabled them for life was one of the most common images we have, at least in Greece, from probably around the world as well, from parades. This is from the October 28th parade. And some of the people who until today or just a few years ago probably were still alive and were very keen to join the parade as some of the disabled, and they opened the parade. You know, these are the first people who opened the parade with the nurses that helped them. Of course, and it is a powerful image, and it's always struck me as something that is really worth looking into. And of course, the research we have about war veterans and disabled war veterans actually covers practically only the 20th century. Images of disabled veterans of the Greek War of Independence, that other war, are around, however, only in the 1840s, late 1840s, 1850s. Images as in the form of paintings. Some of you may know Sakis for his other paintings. This is the one on the left, is one of the least known, but I think a very powerful one, and replicated by Tsokos on the right, or rather Tsokos' first painting, and replicated later by Sakis with the background of Nafplio, most likely. You can see Bougie at the back and Palamidi at the top. And it's a powerful image because it shows that someone is not just, especially in the image of Tsokos, not just a disabled, blind man, but he's also very, very poor. You know, you can see the clothes that they're wearing, and this is the standard image that people already during the revolution project about those who were unable to continue fighting because they had been disabled. I understand that you probably know, at least this audience knows quite a lot about the Greek War of Independence. I'm not going to go into the events that defined this war. I'm just going to make a comment to bring you sort of in at the same to bring you at the moment of where this narrative starts, more or less. That by 1827-28, so by the time the revolution has really taken a turn from the very difficult phase after Ibrahim's campaign and invasion of the Aegean and the Peloponnese, to the Navarino, the Battle of Navarino in October 1827, and to the arrival of Capodicias. It has taken a roller coaster of events from the early years of success to the downfall, let's say, and the downward spiral of the civil wars and the Ibrahim's campaign, all the way to the Battle of Navarino and the achievement of a diplomatic solution between Britain, France, and Russia. This happens at a high level. At the ground level, however, people are suffering the more the war drags on, all the more. And this is clear in, for example, among other cases, in how the American position shifts during the war. So from the Philhellenic declarations of support, pressures to the government of President Monroe, it shifts for a diplomatic intervention, a military even intervention. By 1826-27, all the Americans, including Everett and the ones I will be referring to, Howe and Miller, who go to Greece, they are convinced that what Greece needs the most is humanitarian intervention. So the Americans, interestingly, are some of the most prominent speakers for the humanitarian intervention. But this is not just an American Phil-Hellenic version of the situation, of interpretation, is actually what happens on the ground. And all accounts we have talk about a very destitute situation in which people found each other, not just combatants, not just the people who fought the war, but also their families after several years of burned crops, of absence of agricultural production, and difficulty to even find basic good foodstuff. I will follow up. Interestingly, this is one of our starting slides, and I'm glad Kostis mentioned earlier that a question to Professor Klog was, what new is there to write about it, or what new is there to say really about the history of the revolution? I would say there's one main element that I think is interesting, is that the anniversary has given opportunity, and the digital age primarily, not so much the pandemic. I think the pandemic has accelerated the way we have connected and talked about the revolution. But the digital age that we referred to earlier means that there's so many new sources available, or other sources that were previously unavailable, digitized and available and open to interpretation. So beyond the 200 years anniversary that has given an opportunity for many of us to reflect, and for the general public to, I think, get a much better sense of what happened during those years, beyond any sort of standard stereotypical interpretations. So very briefly, before I go into the main theme of the topic, I would say there's a few new things to say. The first one is the internationalization of the history of the revolution beyond the Phil-Hellenes, or even when we look at the Phil-Hellenes, we now look at them from a much more nuanced point of view. The second very important development in the historiography is the imperial turn. And so the British, French, and Russian, especially with scholars of Russian history who look into the history of the revolution and the involvement of Russia. The third is the Ottoman context in a much more nuanced way than before, meaning with Ottoman sources that people are able to read and refer to the Ottoman response that the revolution caused, generated. And again, I mean, beyond the standard well-known interpretation of the Ottoman response of massacres and so on. That, of course, is being researched. What was the reaction? Massacres by both sides and so on. What emerges more interestingly, in a sort of a more abstract way, is that a revolution was far from a conclusive event. Its outcome was much more contingent, and it was therefore as an event much more unpredictable. So if anyone thought that, from the moment that the revolution started, a Greek state and a Greek nation would form as a political community, I think they should think twice. This was far from the case as late as 1826-27. And even then, there had been cases that Greek provisional governments or Greek key players in the revolution considered alternative solutions, including the act of submission to Britain, so that the Peloponnese practically becomes a British protectorate, or an act of submission even to the Sultan. Another aspect of this new history is a comparative history, but this is, people are more skeptical about this, to what extent you can compare the history of the Greek Revolution to other revolutions in the Mediterranean, and even more, I think, risky, so to speak, with the revolutions, with the nationalist movements, rather, as they're called, of Latin America, of South America. I think this is what's also brought to the fore a much more interesting and much more extrovert, if you like, approach to the history of the revolution. Closer to what I'll be talking about tonight is also a move, I think, for some time now, beyond the sort of false dilemma and older debate of whether the Greek Revolution was a social or a national revolution. This started in the 1920s when Kordatos published his the social significance of the Greek Revolution, social meaning. And it has sort of plagued historians of several generations until about the 80s, 1980s or 1990s, when historians started moving away, let's say, from this debate, whether it was a national, sort of it gave birth to the nation or it regenerated the nation, or was it a social revolution, meaning that it was much more class-based and the interests of those who took up arms were targeted both the elites of the Morea, whether notables or ship owners or those who controlled rather large populations and resources, and therefore it was not just against the Ottomans, but it was also against the sort of upper classes of their world. And I think it's a false dilemma because every revolution is a social revolution, and of course, in some cases, it is also a national one. It has created a nation as a political community. What's more interesting, I think, is that new sources and interpretations are coming to the fore, probably almost as we speak, as I will refer to later. So this is the state that was created in 1830 officially. The borders took us some time to agree. Just to remind you that in the small island of Poros, the border debate started with Capodistrias, then the British, the French, and the Russians. But what I would be most talking about are the islands of Hydra and Spetses, extremely important. The islands of Psara over here, and of Kassos, that can barely be seen here in the south East Aegean. I'm referring to islands because they played a particular role in the revolution. Kassos less pronounced, but still very important. Some other areas that, of course, matter a lot is Nafplio and Athens, the capital, after 1832, and the areas that also were in the border of the state with the Ottoman Empire, especially Acarnania, where many Suliotes settled, Eritrea in Evia, and a few other parts. So this is the state that was created, and we tend to think of sort of a fixed standard interpretation is that once the state is created, it's kind of it moves and grows, but there's a lot of mobility. This is another aspect of the revolution that I found very interesting as people are researching and new interpretations come to the fore. There's a lot of mobility. There are thousands of people who are refugees, and it's not a new theme. Apostos Vakalopoulos talked about the refugees decades ago, the refugees of the Greek Revolution. And it's only recently that this has been acknowledged. And therefore, you have an intense mobility of people from Chios, for example, from Psara, from Crete, who are kicked out of their ancestral lands, and many of them never returned. So the Greek state integrates these populations. And the interesting thing is that these are not refugees only sort of civilians, but in many cases, they're refugees who are fighting, who join the fight, who move from their land when it's destroyed, like in Chios, Psara, or Kassos, or in parts of Crete, and they join the fight. And they're rewarded for this, both them and their families, which I think is another interesting development and sort of strikes a chord from people at the time. Some of the people who spoke about the revolution from very early on, and because they were there to tell the tale, was Samuel Gridley Howe. Well known, especially to a North American audience, a brilliant man, I think, who graduated from Harvard, a medical doctor, and he wrote already by 1828 what is probably one of the most important books about the Greek Revolution. And in his account, he talks about people that he saw were bearing the scars of torture, were maimed, were disabled, were not just malnourished. That's why they needed humanitarian aid, he thought, but they had suffered, the wrath of being a prisoner of the Ottoman army or of having been badly wounded in a battle. And as a doctor, he knew, because he was one of the few people who could actually operate and try to treat many of them. So his first account is much more than a first account. It's also his professional account. So we know that people suffered badly in this war as not just as victims and not just being killed, but also wounded in many cases. And there is a literature, of course, with this. This is not just about the Greek Revolution that and then it's disabled veterans, but and it's war veterans more broadly. But there is a significant exception, I think, in the Greek case, because it is probably the only case that I have found where the state, even in the form of a provisional government, responds very quickly to its most needed. So the people who suffer from who are badly wounded, or their families. And it actually makes a pledge to look after their families as well. So I don't want to take too much of our time, but I'm just going to say that in the American Revolution, for instance, 1776, it is only in 1818 of the law of 1818 that the state seems to acknowledge the fact that people need a pension. So many years, almost 40 years later. In the Greek case, the disabled, or rather the veterans in total, the fighters of the Greek War of Independence, have been studied, but only from a point of view, especially by Elisabeth Sakanika, of their participation in politics. So she looks at Makrigiannis, she looks at a few others who take an active role, and they try to, as Sakanika argues, try to justify their position, their post-war place in the nation, by participating in the politics of the nation, of the state. The people that I've looked at, and I'm going to talk about, they don't seem to be interested in justifying their place in the nation. They just need to survive. So it's a struggle for survival, really, after the struggle for independence and freedom that I think historians have overlooked. And I've identified here some of the key research themes and the data that I'm going to be referring to. First of all, this opens a chapter, a small one, unfortunately, because of the lack of sources, to the history of disability, pensions, and social policy, even at this early stage. The Greek state is supposed to have introduced the policy of social welfare only in the times of the interwar period and the liberal Venizelos government. I think it starts a little bit earlier, in the form of the Othonian state and his administration early on, with the regency of the three Bavarian administrators, and but without making grand claims about what kind of welfare policy this is. This is also very early, obviously very early form of policy, but it is multifaceted, and it is a state, even in its form, in the form that is created during the 1830s, that it has to act in different capacities: to accommodate refugees settled in settlements, to provide pensions, to cater for the people who participated in the war and integrate them in the army of the state, something very contentious, as I'm going to refer to later, because Otto brings almost 5,000 Bavarian soldiers, almost as his personal guard. But there are also interesting issues here about how much did those people receive, those pensioners? What kind of value and how efficient was the administration of the amounts they received? It is, in other ways, a post-revolution, a state-sponsored welfare. It does take place, as I've noted, in the language that is used in the decision-making, as sort of a patronage form of welfare. So, especially in the years of absolute rule by Otto, before the constitutional change of 1843, all this takes place under the paternalistic hand, let's say, and under the patronizing position of the king. It is personified, and people ask personally from the monarch almost a favor. However, it is not only in the sort of personalized way that this takes place. The Greek Revolution government from 1821, already ingrained in the constitutions of 1821-22, in the First National Assembly of 1821, of the second in 1823, and in the Trizina Constitution of 18 and National Assembly of 1827, it is clearly stated that the state will have to provide pensions for those who died, or to their widows and orphans, or to those who were badly wounded. And this is a commitment that both Kapodistrias fulfills. He does feel that he has to continue. It is a pledge that he does not abandon, together with the Constitution of 1827. He keeps that clause in other ways. And in fact, it's one of the most contentious issues in his fight with Hydra and some others who contest his authority. So if you don't know, just to remind you that in the summer of 1831, a rebellion, an open insubordination by Hydra and others takes place, with Hydra as its sort of base, that leads to the burning of two of the frigates of the most valuable ships of the Greek Navy on the port of Poros by Andreas Miaoulis. So the assassination of Kapodistrias in September of that year, in 1830, only less than 2 months later, comes at the sort of follow-up of this sort of very open rebellion that Kapodistrias managed to put down with the help of Russian Navy, in fact. And one of the most contentious issues that the Hydra ship owners and notables were put into Kapodistrias is why the state has not fulfilled its pledge to compensate the island for all its losses in money, including pensions to those who had been killed, or to their families if they've been killed, or to those who had fought. So this is a policy that starts already during the revolution, and it continues in the early years of the Greek state. The settlement and the pensions, this is where things get interesting, I think, from a sort of a point of view of where did these fighters come from. It shows that, the standard interpretation that, the revolution broke out in Macedonia and then it was crushed, or in Olympus Mount and then it was crushed, means that has forgotten almost that many of those people who escaped went and fought in further south. They join, and sometimes in their own bands, in their own regiments, they join the revolutionary irregular army. And they are identified as such as fighters from Psara, Chios, Macedonia, Crete, as well as from many other places. And this is evident in a source that I discovered. It's online, actually, but it hasn't been researched and analyzed until a couple of years ago, when I had the very important assistance of Yorgos Fournaris, an undergraduate student who won a Dean's Award for his excellence last summer, and with the statistical analysis of friend and colleague Petros Peklivanou, who's a health science and decision analysis, the Hospital for Sick Children here in Toronto. But in his spare time that he donated, he worked his wizard statistical skills to help me produce the results that you will see in a few minutes. But before that, let me just say that the Revolution War pensions also opens an opportunity for us to examine, even in this early stage of the first decades of the Greek state, a process of legitimacy that I think is going on here. The state, even in the form of the Greek Revolution government or Kapodistrias in the few years that he ruled, or especially Otto's governments later on, they entered this sort of negotiation with very critical for the regime parts of Greek society. Critical not only in the manpower and in the capacity to wield violence and to wield armed violence, as it has been noted in the case of the bandits. This is well studied about the post-revolution insubordination of people, refusing to submit to the authority of the new state. But I think it also opens a window to a social history of the revolution and the post-revolution state, and about what really happened to the veterans and their families, because we're really talking about a few thousands of people. So it's not a small sample, especially for such a small society. If I may remind you, we're talking about 700,000 people who lived in the state of Greece in 1830s. So we see that already, this is a sort of budget at the time. that shows that from very early on, even under the administration of the Regency in 1834, there was specific amounts allocated for pensions, for dowries, but also a lot of money for one-off assistance, let's say. And this is something that many people seem to request, that they, for some reason, they find themselves in, as many did, in financial hardship, and therefore they write and request financial assistance from the government. So they require monthly pensions, one-off dowries, and assistance. And it is something that continues also a few years later, when you see that the apomachy, or veterans, widows, and orphans, at the time, the state increases the amount they pay for reasons that I will refer to earlier. Just before, this is 1837, just before the Otto's government is forced to declare its first default. Otto's regime came with the first major loan of the Greek state of 60 million French francs, enormous amount at the time. A lot of it was withheld for advance payments, and a lot of it was wasted, as the term is usually commonly used, for the Bavarian army. But some of it was reserved for those who were receiving pensions, the veterans of the army and the navy. And it is those amounts that tell us this was calculated during the period of the revolution, and it continues in the period after the Greek state is created. I'm not going to refer to the legal codex, so all these regulations that show how this happened. But what I'm more interested in is the impact of the revolution on the bodies of the veterans, something that we tend to ignore, but we know from other studies from the 20th century literature on war and its impact on people that it is enormous, it is very long-lasting, it is debilitating in most cases, especially if it's a disability. I also found out that there is a process in this negotiation through the bureaucracy that exists, but it is a conscious attempt to create a bureaucratic process that includes those who it includes an inquiry into those who are deserving veterans versus those who are not. And there is a process of accountability here that I will refer to in a minute. So they write to those who fought with the applicants, those who can vouch for them, and they also need a certification from the notables or from the priests in the places where these people live. So there is a certain bureaucratic process that is going on here. So this is the list of people, the register of those who received pensions as published under the request, following the request of the Greek Parliament in 1850. This is the first conclusive list, so to speak, and the first published one. There were various lists that are circulating in various departments of the economics, of military, of the navy, and of finance before, already since the 1830s. But this seems to be the first conscious attempt to bring together these various sources of bureaucratic offices and to achieve a list that would be fairly conclusive. As the minister says in his outline, the granting of the said pensions was, gentlemen, one of the most beneficial measures of the monarchy. The measure relieved from poverty and hardship whole families of fighters, old men who were ill, relics of the struggle, he calls them, widows and orphans of those who fell fighting for the country. These measures granted to them bread and consoled their grief to the extent that the finances of our state allowed, which is a very interesting qualification, of course. Committees were formed over time and toiled to distribute most of the pensions, while the government always applied strict research process. On the decision to grant its pension, official documents were procured, confirming the services and the sacrifices of those pensions was granted, or their parents, their husbands, and brothers for the widows and orphans. I should say here that at the time, orphan was considered a child that had lost his or her father, so not lost both parents. So when they talk about widows and orphans, they usually refer to the same family of course, there were orphans of both parents, but in most cases they talk about orphans because of loss of their father. So this is what the list looks like. It has the name, the surname, patris, or place of origin or country where people came from, the name, the date of which the government decree was issued, the amount they received, their rank, sailor, for example, here, when did they serve? This is called fairly standard. They sort of copy that. And this is what's the most interesting, or one of the most interesting parts of the source. They outline where people were wounded or killed, on which ship, on what date, and who they were fighting with. The list, in many cases, these special conditions that they describe also refer to what kind of injury they suffered, how badly they were wounded, whether they were maimed, what kind of injury they suffered, and where. And I think this, from the beginning, when I saw this, I thought, okay, this has to be tabulated some sort of way, and see whether we can draw any results, because this is only some of the information that I was able to extract. Let's take also a random example, because this is also interesting, a random, so to speak. Let's take Sakis Gekas, I chose for obvious reasons. Obviously from Skodra in present-day Albania, who received a pension of 33 drachmas because he was in the rank of Ikospendarchos, so he controlled a group of 25 men. He fought in various battles, and he was estrevlothi, meaning he probably broke, not just strained, his left arm while fighting. And this is interesting because, among other things, it's not I'm not a descendant of Sakis Gekas. I can definitely confirm that. Nonetheless, it is interesting because of the multiple places that these people came from. So Enos in Bulgaria, Himara in Albania, Epirus generically, Smyrni, Himara again, Skodra, as I mentioned, in Albania, Evia, Ioanna, Premeti, also in Albania, and Crete. And this, of course, calls obviously for a way to try and calculate that. So what I'll be talking about in the next 10-15 minutes or so is how do we deal with this sort of very clear recording of the embodiment of sacrifices. First of all, we have disability, injuries and wounds, generic, that are described. We have amputations, fingers, sometimes arms or limbs. People are recorded as blinded for one or both eyes, and many are described as limbic, choleni, or incapacitated, or were injured on both arms and legs. And there is, on more rare occasions, there is indication that they were tortured. In one of few cases, there is a reference to their tongue being cut off. Something that was also very clear in the descriptions that Howe gave as well. So what's interesting is the verification process as well. When we talk about which captain, or when they mention which captain or commander they fought for, where they were injured, many at Messaloniki, Messaloniki especially at the Exodus, or Messaloniki in 1826, but also in the Battle of Athens or Neokostro, for fighting against the Arabs, as it's recorded. This is the army of Ibrahim, of course. In many cases, and this is what I initially found, that that was very common, strevlothi, so broke or strained an arm or leg, lost, usually an eye, or blinded, and choleni, meaning limping. So with the help of Yorgos Founaris and Petros Peklivanoglu, I was able to bring these conclusions about where these people came from, first of all. Their place of origin. Although overwhelmingly, this is the number of pensions to veterans. They come from the islands of Vidra, Crete, and some others like Poros, mainly from Attiki and in some cases of Epirus, Himara, Suli, and also from Smyrna, and less so from the Peloponnese, like Tripoli. In Patris, I think there were at least 170. That's why this doesn't correspond to the about 400 or so names of veterans who are recorded, because there are many individual place names, and a few have different spelling. But it seems that almost 40% are what they were called after the revolution heterochthonies. That is, their place of origin was outside the kingdom. So Crete, Macedonia, Albania, Epirus, and a few cases, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Asia Minor, Elispondos, there's two from Syria, and Asia, even broadly mentioned. So this shows that the people who took pensions as veterans who lived in the war, in many cases, were not from the places where that formed the Greek state. Also, the vast majority of people received a few drachmas. For a pension, this is 8 to 20 drachmas a month. This is a low amount. If you estimate that the middle range salary, monthly salary of a teacher was 80 drachmas, and a kind of high salary of a sort of regional administrator was about 200, 250 drachmas per month in the 1830s. So they received sort of a lower end of the monthly sum, but it is a monthly sum. I think it should be noted. You can see here the number of pensions granted to veterans per year, overwhelmingly by 1836. And as I mentioned earlier, this is also for two reasons. Firstly, the regime of the regency, as it's called, the people who took over the Greek administration on behalf of young King Otto until he comes of age in 1835, they seek to legitimize the regime very quickly. One of the ways to do that is to grant pensions through a government decree very early on. The other reason is that by 1837, the first default of the state has already happened. The first inability of the Greek government to continue paying its loan from 1832. The number of pensions to veterans relative to rank is interesting. You can see that, not surprisingly, the vast majority were soldier, higher rank officer, or sailor. Many from the islands of Hydra and Spetses, but also Psara, and a few Pripolitis, which were the people who suffered also very bad injuries, because they were the ones who tried to set fire to the Ottoman ships at night when they were docked. So with the famous Burlotto boats. Let's move to the number of pensions granted to widows and orphans by place of origin. You can see that this is a very clear indication of where the people who were killed during the war came from. So this explains also the very strong insistence of the notables of Hydra that the island is compensated. You see that overwhelmingly the people who came from the widows who received pensions, they lost their husbands and they came from Hydra, Psara. Many people were killed in Messolongi, of course. Crete also figures prominently. Attiki, many from Suli, which means that these are Suliotas who were killed during the war. They were not killed at Suli, of course, but they were killed after they joined the veteran, the army of the revolution, and their wives, which means that their wives and families more broadly had moved to Greece, and therefore they were entitled to a pension. Etoliko in Etolia, across the strait from Kefalonia and Lefkada, is also very high in the number of pensions the widows received, and Spetses and Chios, of course, expectedly, because many people were killed during the siege and the massacre. This is a table with a graph with a number of pensions that widows and orphans received relative to the rank of the deceased veterans. Again, not surprisingly, most were soldiers and sailors. Very few high rank and ranked officers. Overwhelmingly, the number of people who received the pensions are usually a small amount, although it is not so easy to correlate the number of the amount someone received with their participation. So some people may have been killed after a year or so, and they received less amount, or their families received a smaller amount than if they had been fighting than someone who would be fighting throughout and survived the revolution and had suffered only minor injuries. So this is something that I could only do with the help of Petros, because it would be possible for me to find out and think about how to correlate the amount of drachmas someone received, that widows received, in this case, relative to the place of origin. And interestingly, it comes up that the amount widows received relative to place of origin, those the more this is the median amount of 21 drachmas, more from Smyrna, following that from Crete, and then from Poros, Suli, and Attica. The number of deceased veterans relative to place of death is also interesting, which shows that Messolongi, of course, not expectedly again, how many people lost their lives, and the widows or orphans survived that and received a pension. I have to say here that in documents of the National Assembly of 1827 and onwards, special mention is given to the Battle of Messolongi, the Exodus of Messolongi, and the Battle of Athens, which shows that, as we know from other sources, of course, this was some of the most lethal battles for the Greek army. You also have, this is where Athena refers to the siege of 1826, Crete, that figures prominently, and it is not so well studied, I think, for its participation and its role during the revolution, and Maniaki, where one of the most famous heroes of the revolution, Papaflessas, also lost his life. And finally, there's a number of disabled veterans with type of disability recorded. And I think that's what's interesting. You have so many who are generally speaking wounded. There are people who are recorded as stravlothike or broken or strained, maimed, 40 of them, blinded. Katesti anikanos means they were rendered disabled again, and holeni, or has a limb. You see that this is again only a proportion of the injuries and wounds and disabilities that were recorded. The ones with the highest numbers recorded. As I mentioned earlier, this is not just the work I've presented, but especially the work I'm planning to do is from what we could call the digital turn in the history of the 1821 revolution. It was only last month that the archive called 1821 Digital Archive.gr was presented, was launched. I invite you all to have a look. It has something for someone. This is how good it is, but especially for historians of the kind of work that I'm interested in as well. They have already digitized 9,500 of the 23,500 files individuals submitted during, but especially after the revolution, in which they include petitions and follow-up documents, relevant documents of combatants, certificates that chieftains or warlords or notables could submit, that certify the appointment of ranks, include notes by those who were able to submit a letter or those who wrote it on their behalf, because many people are illiterate, as you can imagine, and receipts that people had already received for contribution to the national struggle in money or kind. I have to say that it's a wealth, it's a treasure of sources about the revolution. It gives us a rare glimpse into how people talk about the event. It is interesting, among other things, and I'm going to conclude in a minute, that they don't really talk about a revolution at all. They talk about the struggle for independence. They talk about the war of autonomy. They talk about services that they provided to the war and to the national struggle. And it is a vocabulary that I think we are not so much used to. And again, it is not surprising that so many people who fought in the war expected to be paid to continue fighting. Not because they were mercenaries, because they had to survive and they had to make up for the income they lost agricultural or from shipping and trade that they lost because they were fighting the war and because they had to provide for their families. So this is the reason that the provisional government already since 1821-22 makes a pledge official to cater for those who will be wounded or for the families of those who will be killed. So I just want to conclude by paraphrasing the famous phrase by E.B. Thompson on his history of the working class in England. And I would just say it's not a modest aim, but I think it's a one worth going for, to rescue the disabled soldier, the amputated veteran, the destitute widow, the impoverished sons and daughters from the enormous condescension of posterity, as E.B. Thompson wrote. And also to invite us to rethink the ways in which historians have dealt with the history of the revolution before, and wrote often about the famous and the heroes, but forgot many others. And these are the others. I want to close with this famous fleet, the burning of the famous fleet, of the Turkish fleet, a famous painting by Yezis, who, of course, depicted Canaries, and that we all know about, and rightly so. But I think it's worth knowing about all those people as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Sakis. Thank you for making us realize this new turn of the social history of the nation beyond the big names, the heroes, and the elevated even conflicts between them. I have lots of ideas, but I want to open the floor to our participants for any questions at this point.
Yes. My name is George Tsakos, and thank you very much for sharing your research and your insights. I have one question, clarification primarily. When was the first year where a recognition of veterans and therefore compensation was presented? Was it in 1824 or 25? I missed it.
It's earlier than that. The provisional government, the revolution provisional government, makes a pledge already in the constitution of 1822.
Okay.
So in the National Assembly that took place in Epidavros and in the constitution that followed in January of 1822, they make a specific pledge for the veterans and the apomachi. This is the word they use. The relics of the war that I use in the title is a phrase from 1850. It's much later. But what's important, as I'm glad you identified, is when is the first mention. And I think it's very early. And as I said, this is for two reasons. Just because there is this sense of gratitude, but it's also out of necessity that they need to make sure that people are convinced to keep fighting and to join the forces.
And a related, thank you very much, a related follow-up question is, where did they find the money?
They don't always find the money. This is a very interesting, another new aspect of the history of the chapter in the history of the revolution. And we know a lot more about the finances of the revolution now than we did a few years ago. There's been a dissertation and a book and a few other chapters and research papers that show that the state is already created during the revolution, that it makes an effort when it calculates what they can expect to raise as funds from various islands. They're very prominent. Islands such as Naxos, Santorini, Tinos, Chios, of course, before it's destroyed. Crete, they estimate that if they manage to control Crete, they can raise a lot of money. But in the end, they mostly able to raise money from taxes in kind, as well as whatever cash exists from the Peloponnese. So while there is a budget, it is of course not always realized, and that is why from very early on they realize also that they need to get a loan, because this war cannot be financed from own resources. It's impossible. In fact, they lose money as the war drags on, and that's why they resort to piracy. So the Greek government from 1821-22 up until the Battle of Navarino in 1827 issues licenses for people to be essentially privateers or corsairs. The Hydra is very prominent in that, and it is only that the Battle of Navarino and the British intervention that puts a stop to this sort of open invitation for people to, if they can, loot those ships that are helping the Ottoman war effort, whether Austrian, most commonly, or others, which creates, of course, a case of lack of public order at sea. It is easier to impose order on land, that is, than it is at sea. Until 1828, when with the intervention of the British and Niaulis, who wants to show that piracy has to end and that the waters can be sort of patrolled by this new state, they put an end to piracy. But until that, it is officially sanctioned by the Greek revolution government as a means also to raise funds.
So Saki, Saki,
before we go, I'm sorry, Danny, but I see that Eleni has her hand up. So do you mind if I
I'm sorry.
give the floor? That's okay. That's okay. You probably aren't able to see everyone like I am. So yes, Eleni first, and then Danis. Thank you.
Thank you. These were fascinating data that you shared, and I had no idea they existed. So thank you for that. My question is about the data, actually, and maybe there is more that will make my question a mute, but let me ask it regardless. So I was intrigued by the fact that it seemed that the pensions that were given to like the amputated and like the males, not the widows, like as you pointed out, these were people that were outside the kingdom, not people that were not living or they were not from the like whatever Greece was at the time. But when you showed the data for the widows, so the families of the people that actually died, we saw a very different geographical distribution. And that struck me as a little bit weird because, I mean, it cannot be the case that all the men that fought from Hydra, they died and there were no amputated ones to get the pensions, but the people that were from outside actually were. So I'm wondering if you have any insights as to why this difference in the distribution between the people that died and the people that actually were handicapped or disabled due to the war and the geographical location. And I'm just wondering, I mean, could it be, I don't know, that they would not file for pension if they were male and they were amputated, they lived in Hydra, they had other means, or I don't know, like the funding, wherever the funding was coming from was not covered. It was a little bit weird that this
I think I have an answer. You're right. Thank you for pointing this out. It has troubled me as well. And my answer so far, tentatively, is that Hydra, Psara, Spetses, and other communities, but especially those three, they make a case that they needed they need assistance in form of pensions or one-off financial assistance because their people have suffered the most. But there is also this early insistence that they have on getting money and resources first is, I think, a step in the transition that takes place from a community-based treatment of the deserving disabled, let's say. So when Hydra asks for its own to be treated first and receive pension, two, we have a transition to a national or a social, but also at the national level treatment of the issue when the government has to administer those from other places as well. And I think it's an interesting transition. So while it starts during the revolution from the island of Hydra or Spetses has to look after its own first, over time, and very painfully, as I mentioned, assassination of Kapodistrias is about that pretty much. Over time and very painfully, this process becomes of administering resources about the nation as a whole. of the various places that those who lived after the revolution, or their families if they were killed, came from. And also there is this pensions policy or assistance, more broadly financial assistance, is only part of a state assistance. The most prominent one is providing settlements to people who came from areas that were destroyed or remained outside the Greek state. So from Chios, probably the first refugee district in Aflio is those of people from Crete. I think it's still called like that in Aflio.
Pronia, right? It's called Pronia.
Pronia, that's right, Pronia. It's the Capodistrias refugee settlement in Naflio. But also in Eretria, those from Psara, or in Atalante, or Nea Pella, as they called it, those who came from Pella in Macedonia. So this is a policy that is quite broad-ranging with the resources that are available. But the issue of pensions, you're right, in its relation to those who were disabled and those who lived, is definitely one I need to look more into.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Danny, sorry again for cutting you off, but you're next.
Oh, thank you, dear. Yasosaki, this is Dennis Koromilis.
Hi, Danny.
Thank you again for doing this and sharing this with Philadelphia, like you have with Canada and everywhere. You're amazing. I wanted to ask you one kind of existential question, but it might help a lot of people, especially from Peloponneso. Papaflessa dies in May 1825, and then Ibrahim is about to swallow the entire Moria. The Battle of Navarino, was it economical, political? Was it spiritual? Was it the money? Because they had to stop them. They kept the Turks quiet on the seas while the Greeks still were privateers / profiteers. And they used to show scrolls and stuff. But that Treaty of London had to stick. Did they engage in the destruction of 80% of the Egyptian and Turkish fleet at the Battle of Navarino on October 20th, 1827, to free the Greek nation, or to make sure their investment was going to come back to them?
Okay, that's a great question. It's a bit difficult to answer briefly, but I will do my best. One doesn't exclude the other. You can create a Greek state that could be controlled at the same time that you destroy the Ottoman navy, and also diminish the possibility that this will evolve into an Egyptian sort of mini empire in the region, because I'm pretty sure that this, not many people in London or Paris saw the prospect of a rising Egyptian empire under Muhammad Ali with great, enjoyment. So, and this was proved in the 1830s and even 1840s when the British especially realigned with the Ottoman Sultan. So the defeat of the Ottomans and the Egyptian, both, the joint navy in 1827 means that a threat to extinguish the revolution is gone. So the revolution gets sort of a new life or extended life. But it also means that the loans that
Yes.
the Greek revolutionary government has contracted primarily with London merchant bankers will be repaid. So there is a financial element there. I don't think it is as important as the geopolitical considerations. But as you know, you cannot easily isolate one from the other. And I think it really mattered. I don't know about the spiritual element. I think that's even harder to find out.
All right.
But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
we have time for more questions?
Yes, yes.
Um,
Yeah.
Professor Gekas, I wanted to ask you, what surprised you most from the research that you have done in the recent years on this subject?
What surprised me is the lack of knowledge we have, at least I did, and I think many other people who have been working on that, on the people who actually fought in the revolution. You know, there's been a lot of high level, so to speak, discussions about what happened, you know, geopolitical, diplomatic, you know, national revolution, the role of the church, or sort of well-trodden areas, let's say. But in the process, we've kind of ignored and forgot to actually look into who were actually the people who were fighting. You know, where did they come from? What happened to them during and even after the revolution? And I think that's what I really want to find out more about.
Thank you. One thing that I might add is that it's also surprising to me how little interest has been to really document the actual refugee settlements that were built, like like Pronia, and most of you know of Samuel Howe, as the big Philhellene, and you know that he was very important for the AHEPA and for the sort of elevating the Greek. The respectfulness of Greek Americans during the 1940s by building statues on Howe and showing the connection. But anyway, few people know that one of his greatest accomplishments was to build a refugee settlement outside of Corinth that he called Washingtonia, that he named after
the Washingtonia. Yes.
Yeah,
Thanks for mentioning it.
Which is great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think there's still, Greek historians, with the exception of Christos Lupos or Nikos Theotokos and Nikos Rodzokos and a few others, Petros Pizanias, an old professor of mine at the university in Corfu. People who were, scholars of modern history, whether historians or sociologists, they've kind of, dropped the history of the revolution, which is quite incredible if you think about it, that it's as if we're talking about a university history department in the States or in France that does not include studying the American or the French Revolution. And it is incredibly strange almost that in most history departments in Greece, there are no courses on the history of the revolution. And I think that's reflected also in the fact that we knew quite, just a fraction of what we are able to find out. But I also want to point out that the anniversary of the bicentennial has really invigorated the whole study. And the digital archive I mentioned by Ada Diala and her team is incredibly important. It doesn't just include those sources that I mentioned who are digitized. It also includes tens of digitized books that one can read, many of them in English or French or German, that were produced at the time of the revolution. So this is a whole new field of study, I think, that it's really worth thinking and researching and looking into beyond the year of 2021.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming on Thursday evening. I think there's something on a comment. It is indeed interesting to learn about post-war reality for these soldiers, as most of us focus on the battles. Yes, this is part of the revolution story as a whole. Thank you, Saki.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. If I may respond to this comment, I think that's exactly my initial, my departure point and what I hope to contribute, because these are, lives that were lost or dramatically changed during the Revolutionary War. And so while these people create the nation, so to speak, and there is also a state in which they live afterwards, and they follow lives that they're trying to rebuild in many ways. And I think it's probably appropriate now that we've passed the 25th of March, the March 25th anniversary, and I've been thinking about post-revolution, post-anniversary, to think about what happened to people who fought in the revolution afterwards.
Will, did you have a question? Okay. Thought I saw your hand raised. Okay, well, thank you very much.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it was great meeting you. And all the best from me. Stay well, and I hope to meet you in person at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Saki. Thank you, all
Thank
of you.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Good
Thank you
night.
again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Saki.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.